Welcome back to ChamberTalk, a podcast brought to you by Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce. I'm your host, Finlay Jack, and this week some huge news from the Chamber's 39th Energy Transition Survey. There's a number of key findings from the report. I'll run through them briefly with you. The Chamber reckons any future UK government will have 100 days to save 100,000 North Sea jobs. Confidence is at an all-time low in the UK carbon sector, lower than the financial crash and during the pandemic. And UK-based companies are increasingly focusing their investment in overseas projects and markets. Now, joining me as my co-host and the co-author of the report is Ryan Crighton, the Chamber's Policy Director. Ryan, anything you want to add to some of those key findings?
Yeah, I think it very much suggests to me there's a clock ticking. So we have been doing this survey for 20 years now, and it's pulled together through a survey of industry plus some focus groups which we run once we have the initial first take of the results back. And I think the very clear message, particularly from companies operating in the oil and gas sector in the North Sea, is they're kind of sitting on their hands and waiting to see what the election throws up. So it's probably a good thing that the election's coming sooner rather than later, and we could perhaps put an end to that inertia. But if we get a Labour government, as the polls would suggest, and they proceed with their plans right now, which would be an increase in the windfall tax, removal of allowances, a number of companies that we've spoken to have made it very clear that they will move their business elsewhere. It's not an environment they want to operate in. So it's a very real threat to jobs at the moment, which I think we're going to discuss at length in this podcast today.
And also joining us is Paul Leeuw, the Director of Robert Gordon University's Energy Transition Institute, and Chris Wheaton, an oil and gas analyst at investment banking firm Stifel. Chris, we'll start with yourself and we'll start on jobs. This 100,000 figure that's been quoted by yourself, that's 100,000 of 200,000 jobs risk disappearing by 2029. It has been questioned by some people. Tell us just firstly how you arrived at that figure.
It's pretty clear that if you look at total jobs for the UK, and this is based on the government's own data, so much better than any data I could possibly come up with, that jobs correlates quite strongly with total spending in the offshore energy industry. So that's the total of not just operating expenditure, i.e. the costs of actually day-to-day running of operations, but also the capital expenditure as well. And that those two numbers, so total spend and jobs, have correlated pretty well over the last 15 or 20 years. And if you extrapolate that number forward, as the North Sea stands on a cliff edge, what happens if we take a great leap forward? That means that number of jobs is at risk, about half of the number of 200,000 we've got at the moment. And also, that's going to happen pretty quickly, by 2029, 2030.
And is that, I guess, one of the primary risks you mentioned there, that we're going to be losing jobs at a much quicker rate than we're going to be kind of creating jobs in new greener industries?
That's right, because what we're really seeing here is taxes act as a tax on certainty, and a tax on confidence. And so what we're seeing is companies decide that there's too much uncertainty here, but there's the risk that that capital is either not going to be spent at all, or is going to be taken elsewhere. And for example, Harbour Energy, the UK's largest North oil and gas producer, produces about 15% of UK output. It's spending now $10 billion buying an oil and gas company called Wintershall. They're based predominantly in Norway. The company is currently, Harbour Energy, 95% based in the UK. After it's done this big acquisition, it's going to be about 30% in the UK. Its largest business is going to be Norway, this business it's acquiring. And that's an example of $10 billion that's being spent outside the UK to acquire business elsewhere. And that's the kind of trend of capital flow that we're going to see if these taxes are imposed, and we see the sort of marginal tax rates on the industry rising to the levels that are contained in the policy proposals.
And just on the windfall tax, the current government has said, this was from a quote from a piece in the Telegraph last week regarding Chevron leaving the North Sea, the temporary windfall tax on oil and gas firms actively encourages investment to create jobs and grow the economy. Would you agree with that?
It does. It's yes, it does in theory. The problem is, like most things, in theory, everything works in theory. In practice, it doesn't. And that's what we're seeing. So, we've seen companies definitely ratchet back spend already. And we can see evidence of that in the just the output numbers. If you look at just oil and gas production in the UK, how much that's fallen over the last couple of years. And that's at a time at which energy security has become more, not less important, post-Ukraine. But also because there's the question of what happens next. This is the 12th change, the proposals contained in Labour Party briefing paper would be, I think, the 12th change in taxation to the UK North Sea since 2006. I'm not even sure it is 12. I might have lost count. The thing is, you can't have a change in tax like every other year and expect people to believe, when you say we're going to give you certainty, that is actually going to happen. And that's part of the problem, that when you keep changing the tax, you keep taxing certainty, and that hurts investment.
I think just building on that, maybe bring Paul in as well. We're recording this podcast in a box at Pataudry because we've just had a breakfast for 250 people, exploring these issues. We haven't just come to Pataudry for a day out, sadly. Everyone's looking far too happy for that. I'm just wondering, reflecting on the word from the room, there is clearly a real disconnect between the people in the industry and the policymakers of the country. Why do you think we've got to this point, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to say from the breakfast this morning, hugely sobering message and a real call for urgency, because if we don't get this, we're going to get in the scenario what Chris outlined. We're going to see jobs disappear and the alternative not being ready. So I think absolutely to put a spotlight on here, because if we don't do that, the next government, whoever come in, whatever color, need to actually grab this issue and deal with it. Because if we lose this capacity and this capability, the supply chain, the workforce, the ecosystem to Scotland or to the UK, we can't accelerate our own energy transition, and we end up as importing more activity, which is really the wrong outcome. So I think actually what we need is a real policy integrated plan to make it work. And whoever comes in, I think the urgency is for them to develop that plan and see how to make it work, because then we can see the decline in one industry being offset by activities in another industry. If we get it right, we get a Goldilocks zone right, just one declining, other one going, we can see the workforce transferring, we see the supply chain having continuous future, and we can actually make this a fantastic place. If we get it wrong, shame on us, because actually what we do is we're going to take our capabilities away, we see the people disappearing, supply chain disappearing, supporting overseas activities, and we end up more importing not only just the energy, but also the kind of skills and capabilities to accelerate the energy transition itself.
And just talk to us about this kind of huge prize that could be awaiting us should we get to it, because I know you've authored certainly a report on if the investment is there, the jobs will be created and will be there for people to move into.
Yeah, so I mean, building on some numbers what Chris talked about, Chris probably looks at direct, indirect, and induced jobs. We tend to look at the direct and indirect jobs. But just to kind of give you a flavor, we did a report called Powering Up the Workforce last September, which actually looked at the direct and indirect jobs. If you think about it, if we get it right and we deliver the ambitions set out by UK government, Scottish government, other devolved governments, so we do all the bits and pieces in the UK with the UK workforce, delivering the 50 gigawatts of wind the government is talking about, delivering the 10 gigawatts of hydrogen, delivering the carbon capture and storage. If we do all of that, we can increase our workforce by almost 50%. But if we don't, we see a 15% decline. And this is the issue around the range of scenarios. There's a massive price to get it right by actually developing the UK capability for the energy transition. But there's a massive downside if we don't do it. Now, the problem is, currently, if you think about a direct correlation between investment drives activity and drives jobs, what Chris already outlined, if the investment doesn't go in, the activity doesn't happen, the jobs don't disappear. The jobs will disappear. And this is what we have at the moment. So whoever comes in on and starts a job on the 5th of July, they need to focus, because in their time, we see the decline, what Chris outlined. We also see the opportunity, either we materialize it here in the UK with the UK workforce and supply chain, or we see a lot of that disappearing to overseas companies. And that would be a real shame, because we lose the kind of world-class capabilities and world-class ecosystem we have here in the UK.
Yeah, I think the opportunity isn't just the UK's 50 gigawatts of wind, which is an essential part of the energy transition, and alongside maintaining access to gas for the UK is going to be really important for the UK's energy security. The real prize is the 50 times 50 gigawatts of wind globally. That is just a fraction of the wind power that the world will need as it makes its energy transition. And so much of that could be engineered and designed here up here in the northeast. And the opportunity to lose that opportunity would just be such a shame when the UK starts with such a world-leading position.
And if I can add something, it's a real tricky one, right? Because we're talking about jobs, and Chris very powerfully talks about potentially 100,000 jobs at stake. Of course, if you look at the people we have, they're highly qualified, right? So half the working population is degree educated, either university degree or vocational degree. They will get a job somewhere else. It is an issue around economic displacement, right? So a lot of these jobs will go somewhere else. Some people retire, and yes, we'll see some impacts. People will find it difficult to find a job. The vast majority will find a job somewhere else. But it's about the economic impact is huge. And as Chris said, it is a massive worldwide opportunity. We could be the absolute global hub of developing, particularly the offshore wind sector, but also the energy integration, connecting wind into power for offshore facilities, the connection with hydrogen, the connection with carbon capture and storage. There's a winning story here, and we have to go after it, develop the winning story, keep the workforce, and again, export from here. This is our collective mission if we dare to accept it. But if we don't do it, it will go somewhere else. And that would be a very, very poor outcome for everyone.
These are obviously conversations that we've been having for a number of years now. How do you think we educate our policymakers, our politicians on these issues? Do you think, are they aware of them but choose not to listen to it because they see polls showing that the windfall tax is a popular policy? Or do you think they just don't grasp the complexities of what is an enormous economic challenge?
I think it's a combination, right? So the first thing is it's a complex story because it's transition, not a switch over, and you need an integrated plan. At the moment, it's very hard to come, not with the ambition, but actually turn it into a real roadmap and a plan what to do. And again, that's kind of what I think need to happen. But also, of course, this is an election period. People want to go after your vote. And then again, whoever's going to live it has to be there for the next 5 years to deliver it. I hope we're going to have more sensible voices in the room afterwards, because whoever's in power going to have to find a way to make this transition work. And of course, society will hold them to account, because this is very transparent. What progress do we make? Are we going to meet our 2030 targets under the United Nations COP process? Are we going to deliver it? And of course, the workforce was saying, where are my jobs? And so I think it is going to be a very transparent, very open element. And there's a difference between an election and getting your vote and the reality of delivering it. And I think we'll see that switch over point happening as we get out of the summer window.
Let me leap in there and just say, the windfall tax contains this strange paradox that was described by this American economist in the 1970s, a guy called Arthur Laffer. He described a situation where you can increase taxes so much and they'll increase tax revenue. And beyond a certain point, as you increase taxes, you decrease the amount of tax revenue you generate because you start to disincentivize tax investment, because more of your economics, more of the profit is taken in tax. And so you don't raise the tax revenues you think. And so explaining that paradox, that actually if you put taxes up, you'll generate less tax because you'll have fewer people employed. You'll be having less investment. You'll be generating less national insurance, less VAT. You won't be spending as much money, and that'll ripple through the supply chain. But the epicenter of a lot of that is going to be up here in Aberdeen. Explaining that paradox isn't simple. It's nuanced. It's complicated. It's not immediately obvious. And yet that's the paradox I've talked about in some of my research. That actually, yes, it looks like you'll raise money, but actually you won't raise as much as you think, and then you'll lose a whole load of money because you'll lose all the jobs. I think that's the kind of nuanced argument we need to make, which during an election campaign, it's going to be difficult, but that I think is the challenge that the industry needs to step up and face.
Yeah, and there's a reality check, right? Because the world around us is not static either. You look at what the Inflation Reduction Act is doing in the US, you do what the Green Deal is doing in Europe, many other countries are doing it. The competitive environment is shifting, and they're actually pulling in the supply chain, pulling in resources, pulling in capital. So if the UK wants to compete and hold on to some of its kind of world-class capabilities, it has to be competitive. And this is not a story just about windfall tax, because you have a windfall tax for 7 years. It's not a windfall tax, it's a tax, right? Let's just call it what it is.
It quacks like a tax, it walks like a tax, it makes like a tax, and it's a tax.
But it undermines investment, and investment is extraordinarily mobile, of course. It goes to other places. And contrast what's happening in Norway versus what's happening in the UK. So Norway, of course, same ambition to be the cleanest, greenest place. post the kind of invasion of the Ukraine, they kind of became the leading gas supplier to Europe, and actually huge amount of investment goes in to provide the energy resilience, energy security. But the revenues of that are now kind of being used to making a greener transition happening faster. There are different models of making it happen. It's a different competitive environment. If we get it right, we would actually we are going to be again a leading nation. We're not on that trajectory yet, and I think that is the opportunity for whoever comes in, works with the devolved governments to set us up for success. That will require collaboration to a level we haven't seen before, urgency to a level we haven't seen before, but also commitment and a trilateral arrangement between industry, government, and regulators to set us up for success. This is a completely different way of working, and so whoever comes in, what an opportunity to make it happen.
I think the urgency point's absolutely right there, because if these changes happen, there's no going back. You can't undecommission a field once it's been cut up and taken away. And so, this is the risk of mixing my metaphors. This is a one-way street. We're going down. I'd also absolutely emphasise the points made on mobility of capital. The UK doesn't have to have money invested in it if people don't think it's worth investing in the UK or it's too risky. That capital will go elsewhere. And we've already, started to see that. As I've said, my example with Harbour Energy choosing to deploy a significant amount of capital in Norway. A lot of government support for renewables for the energy transition is also specifically tied to what's effectively protectionism or nearshoring. And you can see that with Europe, and you can see that with the US and the Inflation Reduction Act, very much talking about how much money invested in renewables and in the energy transition is being spent in the US. That is a very explicit goal of the Inflation Reduction Act, to make sure that is maximised. And so the UK needs to realise that in the modern world, it's got to be able to compete for capital against these kind of bigger players such as Europe and the US.
And how do we ramp up job creation in renewables in this country? So that's one of the key policy recommendations of this report today. Clearly, there's been a big focus on the windfall tax and on the huge issues facing the oil and gas sector. But over the last 9 years, we've seen jobs in renewables increase from about 25,000 to 29,000. That's not fast enough to replace the jobs we could potentially lose in oil and gas. So where has it gone wrong so far, and how do we turbocharge job creation in renewable energy?
Yeah, so let me kickstart. We put our report out last week around how do you do a just and fair transition, pathway to just and fair transition. And we say, what's the activity you need to do to actually get the jobs? And it's really clear, if you want to accelerate, particularly wind, and this is a decade of wind, next decade will be far more around hydrogen and CCUS. But if you really want to accelerate wind, you're going to have to accelerate the planning, consenting, access to the grid. And that's a really tough one. But the current rules don't work, right? We see it across Europe. It's really hard to do so. You need to think about different business models. So you might think about regional pricing. It might be incentivizing local communities, because if you see where the wind is being generated, north of Scotland, and where the consumer is, would tend to be in the south of England. Of course, the people along the route don't have the benefits, they only have the disadvantages. So you need to figure out how you incentivize people along that route. So there are models where this is working, where you can do a different approach. So the current way is too slow. We don't get the jobs fast enough. The other thing we need to start thinking about is when these projects come on stream, because when the project come on stream and you do final investment decision, and you want to place your contract with UK companies and UK supply chain, you better have the factories and the capability here. So you actually have to start building that capacity ahead of final investment decision. So if you think about a lot of the wind activity that comes in, the back end of this decade, large scale, early next decade, we really have to start building the capacity 2-3 years ahead of that. And so there's a real incentive for government to accelerate the planning, accelerate the consenting, get far more community engagement, do good potential differential pricing for the product itself, but also incentivize building the capacity and potentially support the manufacturing capability here in the UK, and build this kind of new capacity we've done for oil and gas, but then for the wind sector. It's not happening. And I think, again, refocusing money, refocusing priorities on that will be a great way to go. If we don't do that, and we don't have the capacity, you simply don't have the activity and the jobs here. Again, you end up offshoring a lot of that capability to other places.
How do we ensure that whatever future government gets the keys to number 10 listens to and heeds these warnings that are coming out almost on a weekly basis now? How do we ensure they listen and they act upon what industry experts are saying to them on a regular?
let me go first. Let me go first. I think, there was that awful phrase Michael Gove uttered. I think, the nation's had enough of experts. Well, the problem is experts, they know what they're talking about. The key messages here are very simple. It's about jobs. It's about energy security. It's about emissions for the windfall tax. The North Sea sustains jobs and an ecosystem that is going to be vital to the energy transition in the future. It's about energy security. Our projections are that the UK could end up importing 80% of its gas by 2030 and 90% by 2034. And that's not in an environment where gas just goes away because we've got renewables replacing it. That's when we still need gas, because to offset the intermittency of renewables, when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, we need that backup to make sure the lights stay on. And it's also about emissions. Making a very simple point that if we don't produce our own energy, we've got to still import it from somewhere, and that means if we're importing it at higher emission content than if we'd be generating that energy domestically, and we're also not getting the jobs and the tax benefits of doing so. So I think there's very clear messages about jobs, energy security, and emissions that the industry needs to focus on.
If I add a few points to it, right? I think it's very well said. I don't think any of the political parties have an argument around a destination, net zero by 2050 or 2045 in Scotland. This is a conversation about the journey, how to get there, right? And that's a very different conversation. There is no current plan in the UK or in Scotland what gives us the roadmap to net zero. The energy strategy to be developed in Scotland, but also the UK government will have to put that plan in place. So actually, there's a real window of helping to inform to put that plan in place. And why do I say that is relevant is because we have a national determined contributions. We have to have, under the COP process, committed to get reductions by 2030 and then onwards from there. So there needs to be a credible plan. And I think whoever comes in power needs to help and work with industry, regulators, and all the other stakeholders to develop that plan. So I think there's a really good window to do so. Also, there's an element of really explaining what's the consequence of getting this wrong. And there's a consequence, economic consequence, there's a jobs consequence, and there's an emissions consequence. One thing that Chris talked about, absolutely clear what are the value to get it right. Now, again, I live in a world, we can create our own future. We shape our own future here. If we get it right, we end up with a bigger economy, more jobs, a world-class supply chain, and the ability to export from here. That's a winning story. And I think that for a politician, that's a really attractive story because it helps the voters in the future as well. At the moment, we need to get to that world, and I think everybody has a role to play to set that up for success.
Yeah, I'd say that the UK has the chance, is a world leader in whole swathes of expertise around wind, around the energy transition, the future really difficult problems like energy storage, for example, which is the whole problem, or the big problem I see between taking intermittent renewable generation and making it dispatchable like we have, like the conventional power and energy system we have today. We've got huge potential to be world leader in those things. And I said the prize in 2050 is the UK has a meaningful part of the market share globally of those kind of industries, and has all the fantastic number of high-paying jobs and skills and engineering, and people have brought jobs and investment here because of the jobs and investment that's already here. We get this virtuous circle. That's where we can get to in the next 10 years. But everyone's got to work together, and that's not just policymakers, in government, which must be sometimes about taking decisions that not taking decisions that are superficially easy, but actually, we do, to quote John F. Kennedy, we do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. There will be hard decisions to take that may look the wrong ones in the short term, but it's for the long-term best outcome for the country. And I think, that's the prize we've got in 2050 of being the UK being a real contributor, not just having decarbonised itself, but being a key part of the decarbonisation of the whole global economy.
Yeah, and I think you're right, because it's a real opportunity, right? If you think about where we are in Northwest Europe, really strategic place. We're one of the windiest countries in this part of the world, right? We have a huge market on our doorstep. Actually, the wind resource, what becomes a hydrogen resource, a carbon capture resource, repurposing, rewiring, replumbing the North Sea. We are in an incredibly strong starting point. But we better use it. If we don't use it, again, shame on us. But actually, it's not just for sorting out the UK, but also energy resilience in Northwest Europe. And I think actually, Chris, you're absolutely right, is how do we make that work? Because actually, we need to start thinking way bigger than just actually sorting out the next 5 years and what happens there. This is a generational story about rewiring and replumbing and repurposing the energy system here.
Yeah, and helping other countries to do that. The UK, as you say, has got this fantastic wind, this sceptred isle, this jewel set in a many splendid sea, the great Shakespeare. We've got that opportunity to help the world decarbonise and generate huge economic benefits for the UK for doing so. As I've said, we should have our own kind of Vestas. We see a huge Danish success story taking wind globally. Why can't the UK do that? The UK should do that for energy storage. Carbon capture and storage, again, somewhere where the UK's got incredible resource and opportunity. And we're starting to lose that first mover advantage to places like Norway, who are really investing in carbon capture and storage and starting to sign deals that will import carbon from other countries and store it. The UK should be world leader in that. And I hope some of the policy decisions made in the next 12, 18 months, because it is that kind of near-term window we've got. It's going to set the direction for the next 2 decades, and that's why I think it's really important to get the next 2 years right.
You've touched on the urgency there, and I think it's probably worth talking about that. Just to round up, Ryan, the phrase that you used in the report was 100 days for 100,000 jobs. Does that really just hammer home the message of how urgently the future UK government has to really get this right?
Yeah, I think Chris has just made the point very well. I think, as I said right at the start, the conversation we've had is that people are on the verge, or companies are on the verge of quitting the UKCS as a consequence of the windfall tax and what they see potentially coming from a new government. They need to be persuaded that the UKCS is the right place for them to invest their money. As we've touched upon in this discussion, capital can go anywhere and go anywhere else very quickly. I think we've got a real short window to convince some big players in the North Sea that this is the right place for them to invest their money, and that they will be able to recycle their profits here into some of these big renewable energy investments which we touched on.
I hope that on day 101 we still have a plan, right? So because of course there's a summer holiday, there's a lot happening with the government party, but I think the urgency, what you're saying from a chamber perspective is absolutely right. But this is a long-term plan, right? This is a journey it's going to take quite a long time to get there. So I think getting the message across, absolutely, when the new players coming in, is going to be critical. But I think this is a game we're in for a long time to set up the success of the UK in the energy space.
And hopefully we're a bit further on by the time of the election. For example, we know what GB Energy is and what it's going to do and where it's going to be based. Aberdeen, clearly. But I think that's going to be a big part of this debate as well. We need to understand what that's going to be and what it's going to do. So hopefully we don't get to the polls on July the 4th and we're still in the dark about what GB Energy is going to do.
Wonderful. Gents, thank you very much for joining me this morning at Pataudry. That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. Thanks to Ryan, Chris and Paul. The full report is accessible on www.agcc.co.uk. Please like, share and subscribe to Chamber Talk. We'll see you next time.